thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ed Behrens. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine, and I am thrilled to be joined by Tamar van Riessen, who is a curator of 17th century art at the Rijksmuseum and also the co-curator of the aforementioned Frans Hals exhibition. And I am also delighted to be joined by Benjamin Moser, author of The Upside Down World, Meetings with the Dutch Masters. And I think I'm going to say heap no more praise upon them. And we're just going to get on with it straight away. Tamar, I wonder if we can just begin, and feel free to leap in, Ben, with a potted biography so we know what time period we're dealing with and sort of the big events in Hals's life.
So let's start on Frans Hals first then. Welcome to you all. Frans Hals, a painter from the 17th century, was probably born between 1582 and 1584, but we don't know exactly. So we do have some kind of mysticism around Hals. And I think it's really interesting because we claim him as a Dutch master painter, but he was actually born in Antwerp. And what we actually see is that at the end of the 16th century, Hals and his family, and he was then still a toddler, flee Antwerp and then they go to Haarlem. And I think we really have to take into account that we are in the midst of the 80 Years' War. And because of the fall of Antwerp in 1585, lots of artists and artisans, they move up north to Haarlem, Delft, Amsterdam. And Hals's family, they settle in Haarlem. And actually, Haarlem at the time was, after Amsterdam, the biggest city in the 17th century, really big center for textiles and beer. And Hals's family was also dealing in textiles, so they settle in Haarlem. About those early years, we don't have a lot of information, but we know that Hals trained with Karel van Mander, a really important writer also from the southern Netherlands. And he trains with van Mander. And his earliest known paintings are around 1611, 1612-ish. And he's then actually in his late 20s, beginning of his 30s, so relatively late.
Which is unusual for an artist at that time.
Which is really unusual because most painters actually started earlier. And we do think that also Hals was creating independent paintings before that time. But again, what these works were, we don't know. They may be still somewhere in like an attic or on a yacht. But
we
the
hope.
earliest...
If anyone knows, please.
Or maybe at Tefaf. Yeah. But the earliest known works now are like 1611. And in 1616, he actually has his major breakthrough when he paints one of the militia paintings. And I think it will show up on the screen later on. So 1616 really marks this beginning of his career in Haarlem.
Great. And we don't really know what was happening in that period when most people who became artists were producing works that we see. It is just a lacuna in the life of Hals.
Well, I mean, we know of Haarlem that it's not only a center for textiles and beer, but also a center for art. And there are lots of painters in that city, such as Verspronk, who we know did look to Hals, but did have a more cleaner and neater style. So it is like a center of art, but Hals left no letters, no diaries. So we'd like to think that he came into contact with loads of people, but actual evidence, I haven't found. But it's like a dream of a curator to still find lots of documents that can make things more clear. So yeah.
And while you were working on this exhibition, what did you learn about Hals that was sort of new and surprising?
Well, to start off, it was my first major exhibition. So I began at the Rijksmuseum in 2021 as an intern. So, it was a really big project to do with like a whole team. So that was a learning curve. But then again, on Hals, when I studied my undergraduate studies, I learned a lot about art, painting, and also the 17th century, but not about Hals. He wasn't in the major books that I was given. So I actually had this chance to work for like 3 years almost to really dive into Hals, to look at all of his paintings, to make a selection with my senior colleagues as well. So it was like a journey for me from like A to Z rather than beginning at like K or like M. Yes. And I think what struck me most is that this 17th century is really seen as, if I would ask my friend, as like this really dull period of like only a glorious period of just portraiture. But what you actually see is that Hals, yes, he is doing portraiture, but he is also doing genre paintings. And these paintings are of people that have no name, are unknown, but they also smile. So for me, I'm starting to look at Hals as of like this painter who is not just painting really wealthy people from Haarlem or Amsterdam, but actually who is like this painter of people from all walks of life, as we also see faces, known or unknown, that also walk these streets of Haarlem. So I think that was a real eye-opener for me,
Yes.
that Hals brings much more to the table than I originally thought. Yeah.
Ben, can I bring you in here because you use biography to illuminate large aspects of the artist's work. What is it particularly about Hals's biography that you see in his paintings?
Well, I think that when you see this show, I've seen it now in London and in Amsterdam, what you get are two things. Besides just the genius of him as a craftsman, which is really unequaled, the first thing that you see is the city of Haarlem, which is really amazing, and especially when you walk through these galleries and you see these people, and as Tamar mentioned, it's not just the Baron of something and the whatever, it's actually people that you would have seen. I mean, so these are people, so these would have been wealthy people here. This is the painting that Tamar is mentioning. This is the first big painting that he makes when he is, about 30. And then this guy who's sort of very pleased with himself. But you also have the Malle Baba, which is the mad woman of Haarlem, is how she's known. And she's still a symbol of the city. But you have a range of people and a range of people doing things that really is comparable to what you would later get with photography. So you would have street photographers like Cartier-Bresson, or like, I write about Vivian Maier a little bit in the book, who was this nanny in Chicago who walked around and just took pictures of people on the streets. And that's really unusual, because even 100 years before, portraiture was really only reserved to the wealthy. And even among the wealthy, they were often still in some pose. They were maybe a donor to a religious scene or something. So you have a kind of emancipation of the individual that's really exciting, and you really think you know these people. So that's the first thing that you get to know is Haarlem. And the second thing you get to know that I think is really thrilling is, I've written a lot about this in other works of mine about photography, but you always think when you're looking at a photograph or a portrait that you're seeing the person that's in the portrait. So like portrait of Ed Behrens, you think, oh, but actually if you see Ed painted by Lucien Freud versus by Annie Leibovitz versus, Marcel Duchamp.
It's the exhibition everyone wants to see.
That's exactly. I know it's coming in 2026. Tamar's next big challenge.
Sure.
But it's something that you really realize you're not really seeing the person that is portrayed. You're seeing the artist. And when you see Hals's people, you really get a very clear sense of him, and it's very thrilling. You really, I mean, I'm sure you did too. Clearly, if we're all sitting here, you really like him, don't you? He's quite a wonderful guy. And it's funny because you don't, despite having painted all these other people, we really only have one, maybe, self-portrait of him. Rembrandt, we have 80. Hals, we have 1 and maybe a half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But he's very present.
And what is it you think, this is to both of you, what is it you think that makes him so likable? Is it his conviviality, the drunkenness? Are you just absorbed by endless drinking? Or is it the smiling? I mean...
Well, not the drunkenness. I think the happy nature of each of those paintings. I mean, Hals was one of the first painters to actually paint smiling people. And smiling was seen as something that was not done in that period. I mean, laughing like uncontrollably, or like laughing at rude words, or even showing your teeth was seen as unbecoming, and then especially for adults and also women and children. So I think when you look at those paintings by Hals, I mean, in his official portrait, you have like a slight smile.
It's a little ironic.
Yeah, almost. But then in these genre paintings, you actually have these merry drinkers, those fisher boys, like a woman selling fruits and vegetables. I mean, when you stand in one of in front of those paintings, they come into contact with you because of their character, because of their emotion. And I think that's what really drew me to Hals, that really joyfulness and happiness, and not really the drunkenness, because that's also something that was coined in the 18th century.
Right, and this is also, there's no real evidence for it. Hals actually lives quite a long time. He lives much longer than any other Golden Age painter. He lives to be 84 at a time where, and if you, just for comparison, Rembrandt dies at 63 and is considered very old. And I mean, in my book, I write about a lot of different painters, but a lot of them die at, Potter dies at 27. Fabricius dies at 32. Vermeer is quite old comparatively. He gets to be 43. So to live to be 84, he couldn't have had, I mean, maybe some people who drink too much live long, happy lives, but most of them didn't in that time, and still probably. But there's something very, there is that conviviality, and there's a kind of friendliness. And when I was working on my book, I got to do, and I wish I could show you my phone and put it up here, because I love archives and documents, just like, I mean, if we're here, this is what we like. But I got to see last week, I was filming for a German documentary about Hals, and we got to see the archive pieces that are still preserved in Haarlem in the North Holland archive. And really all we know about Hals is tiny, tiny lawsuits. And it's so tiny. I mean, he gets sued 3 different times by his baker. He has 14 children. There's a record of getting sued by somebody else for butter and cheese. There's a lawsuit over socks. There's a lawsuit about, I mean, just you can't imagine the poverty of his life. I mean, it's not even poverty now, at least in this part of the world. You can't imagine that sort of poverty anymore, luckily. And yet, he is not a depressed person. You get the feeling that this is somebody who really enjoys life and loves it, but at the same time, as he gets older, and this is what's so fascinating about seeing Hals chronologically also, is that you see his style, which is, if you see these sleeves here, just how it's painted so freely, but at a certain point, the style starts cracking up. And you see this old genius who just doesn't give a fuck. And it's so exciting. It's a kind of freedom that only a great genius can find, but it's also something you have to earn.
Yes.
And those are the great group portraits that we see at the end of the Rijksmuseum show.
So I think we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. I'd like to pick up, you mentioned character. And I think one of the things that almost anyone who is vaguely acquainted with Hals will say is he's so characterful, he's so great at depicting character. I'm very intrigued in the how of that. So how does he do it? How does he make those faces seem so human? And also, whose character is it that we're seeing?
So I think his painterly style is so important when it comes to depicting character. And what we see is that Hals is painting in a way that wasn't very self-evident at that time, because if you were a young and upcoming painter, you were taught to paint your subject very sleek and very neat. And what Hals is doing is using these really loose and wild brushstrokes that if you come up really close, I mean, we do have barriers, so you can't get too close, but if you get closer than normal, you really see this abstract nature, and I think that really helps when conveying character. And I think if you look at those paintings, they almost seem like a snapshot. Like the lute player, for example, he has his head like really sharply turned, his lute very high, and that's not a pose that you can do for an actual really long time because it's very tiring. But Hals made no sketches, he made no drawings, no preparatory studies. He was a painter with paint on paint on paint every single time, rather on canvas or on panel. So he must have been really good at observing to really capture that spirit, that character, that pose of the person that he was depicting. And I think I'm of the opinion that Hals painted more known characters than invented character heads or tronies. With Malababbe, for example, for a really long time we thought it was a character or like a symbolism of folly or of foolishness. But like I think a couple of years ago we did find out that actually Malababbe was a well-known figure in Haarlem. And Malababbe was the nickname of Barbara Klaasdochter, who was actually sent to the workhouse of Haarlem, or the dollhouse, because of her neurodiversity. So she was actually well known. And that dollhouse was known to Hals because his own son, Peter, was there for a limited time, and also his daughter, Sarah. So if you now know that story, then you see what's happening to those kinds of people. But I don't think Hals painted lots of invented characters. I mean, those fisher boys that we have in the exhibition, they could well be fisher boys coming from Zandvoort to Haarlem to sell their fish. I mean, and I think that's what's really important when we look at character, is taking into account that probably most people that we see were actual people. And I think that's what changed in my perception of Hals, as I was mentioning earlier, is that we see like this real diverse cut of like the 17th century society. And lots of smiling, laughter, character. But I think in part that has to do with his painterly style and the fact that he most likely saw these people and was able to capture them with like the flick of a wrist. Yeah.
Does that ring true for you too, Ben? How does the character express?
Well, this is often used against Hals also. We should point out, this is often a sort of condescending remark. It's just character. I think that when you plunge into the Dutch Golden Age, I'm surprised and appalled and shocked and horrified that people think the 17th century is boring. I mean, it's anything but anything that, you know, it's in this country and in this culture, it is sort of the great thing that everybody sort of has to do in school a little bit, and you kind of know something about it, and people are always complaining about it. But as with Shakespeare in England, for example, it's something that you can't really, it's the basis of the culture. You can't really get away from it. And the inventiveness of the idea of character is something that relates, and I think it's an art of the theater. It's an art of invention. It's not, you know, it looks like a snapshot, and it also looks often, you know, Tamar is talking about the methods. Some of the paintings are made very quickly, but some of them aren't. And some of them you can see from the technical research, they actually took years. It takes years sometimes to make something look like it was made in half an hour. And this is the genius that you see in dancers, for example. Like a dancer who can go up into the air and spread her legs and do 3 back flips. She's doing that because when she was 4 years old, she started going to dance class every morning at 6 a.m. Or just like musicians who can play something spontaneously. The reason they're spontaneous is because the work that, you know, we don't see if you're sitting in an audience. And it's funny that we don't have his youthful stuff. So with Hals, it's actually sort of like a musician that you just see walking on the stage. You have no idea of what struggles came before that. Hals just kind of walks onto the stage. And he seems fully formed. I mean, there is an evolution, but he appears to us as this fully adult figure.
Yeah. So what's interesting with what you're saying is also then what happened after his death. Yeah. And I think now might be a time to discuss what is somewhat tiresomely called reception history. But obviously after he died, his reputation did not continue to flourish, and he was roughly ignored for a couple of hundred years until in the 19th century. For various reasons, he was rediscovered and lionized, and the Impressionists in particular were drawn to his brushstrokes. So I think there's a question.
Can I just interrupt there for
Please
1 second? That's true. This is a little audience participation moment here.
Ooh.
Only 2 Dutch painters were not forgotten. Mm-hmm. Does anyone know who they were? One is very obvious. No, of the 17th century. Rembrandt and? Jasper? Huh?
No.
No.
Vermeer was rediscovered.
By the same man rediscovered Hals.
The second one, the Dutch stain. Somebody said that?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Jan Steen. Those are the only 2 that were constantly, and Jan Steen in part because he becomes part of the Dutch language and he becomes part of the culture, the sort of popular culture. So they all get rediscovered, but what's fascinating about Hals and to me, this reception history, it is a terrible term, Ed.
Isn't it depressing? I'm so sorry that I brought
Horrible.
it up.
But anyway, we all, the funny thing is, it's what I was saying about how you look at a character and you think you're seeing Tamar, but actually you're seeing the photographer, you're seeing the painter as much as you're seeing the person portrayed. We always do this. And at TAFEF, I know there's always some anxiety among dealers and among collectors about, are these things still relevant? Does anybody still care? Everybody wants the $7 gazillion Damien Hirst toenail or something, and they don't want Rembrandt, And but I think that this is something we, as a curator, as an editor, as a writer, as a collector, as a curator, you bring this to it. You have to find the ways to make it relevant, and I think that you might not find that connection to certain artists, certain even nations. You might like Dutch art more than you like Italian art. All right, I mean that's fine. That's your. But I think what's fascinating about Hals is just how many different periods have connected him to something that they found relevant in their own time. And so in the 19th century, with the rise of photography, from the 1830s and 1840s, and then it becomes very popular. By the 1860s, Hals becomes one of the great figures, and he's absolutely venerated by Whistler. I tell in my book about the dying Whistler who comes from London, and the guards at the Frans Hals Museum, they know who he is. And it's a great painter who's dying, and they let him put his hand on the faces of the old women, which are also in the show. Van Gogh says that he doesn't have one black; he has 27 different blacks. And now I guess now you have a new show, and what do you do with it? I guess that's the challenge. Maybe the show is throwing out to all of us.
Yes. You don't have to answer that.
I mean, just to point out really quick is that these Impressionist painters, they looked back on Hals because he was, in his time, breaking the rules, and they were actually doing the same thing.
Yes.
And I think what's really interesting to see is that at the end of the 19th century, as you mentioned, Haarlem grows out into this place of pilgrimage almost, with Vincent van Gogh, John Singer Sargent, Max Liebermann, also Whistler coming to Haarlem, then still by steam train, obviously. It's such a fascinating thing, and at that time, the Frans Hals Museum was recently opened. I mean, 1862 almost. So I think that is such an interesting period to look at the reception of Hals, because that's the moment when it changes.
Yes.
But then again, what we've seen in the last several decades is that Hals's reputation is slowly dying down again. I mean, when I studied, I had no lessons on Hals, so I think if I were to say what we try to do...
Can I just say I'm completely fascinated by
I was going to say...
This is a totally astonishing piece of information, but...
I mean, the books were on Rembrandt and Vermeer.
But he was traditionally, in the Dutch tradition from the 19th century, the three great painters are always those three.
It was with Hals.
Yeah, with Hals, of course.
With Hals, and then you see it just becomes Rembrandt and Vermeer. And what we're trying to do now is to bring him back into that three-tiered group-ish. And what you also see is that the last major show on Hals was in 1989 in Washington, London, and Haarlem. So, I mean, 35 years ago. And in that period of time, we noticed that the general visitor, also of the Rijksmuseum, we did some inquiries, aren't able to say, okay, this is the most known painting by Hals, or this is my favorite by Hals. But if you would ask that of Rembrandt...
Of Dutch people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be the Night Watch, or the Girl with the Pearl Earring, or the Milkmaid, but with Hals, that wasn't so much the case.
Yes.
So, whereas he was really popular and idealized in the 19th century, that is much less the case today. So
but how many tickets have you sold?
140,000, so yeah.
So it's not really true. People still love this. It's incredible.
Maybe it also has to do with Vermeer last year.
Yeah, but Vermeer was also forgotten, all these things. And so I think what's really going to be fun to see because you have these shows, you write a book, you have a show, you make a documentary, something like that. And it'll spark something if you're lucky. I think that's the goal of a show, is for some 23-year-old photographer from Uzbekistan to show up and just have their mind blown, and then maybe in 10 years something will come out of it. And to give people the opportunity to get acquainted with it, And maybe they'll do something with it, and maybe they won't. I mean, I've been to so many shows that I thought, wow, that's great, I love that, it's so interesting. And then I walk out the door and you never think about it again. And then there's books too, even and people are like this as well. Or like that song that gets in your head and that you just keep thinking about. And, you know, that's going to be the fun thing about the future of this show is like, what's going to come out of it? Yeah.
So can we try and take a fool's errand? And if we're saying that one of the things that attracted him to the Impressionists was his brushstrokes, his technique, and then like that sleeve, and then there's also elements of character, but also ambiguity to his work, which seem very modern. And Ben, you were talking about those pictures at the end where he's using his style to transform everything. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then also maybe why don't we think about it in the context of what does that mean Hals is doing today?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I think it's a little bit of a... I mean, people are always breaking rules that everybody has been breaking for thousands of years, and they think they're the first people to think of it. This is really consistent in art history and in any sort of cultural history. But what's fascinating, and I'm sorry, I don't know what the circumstances are, the Fitzwilliam portrait from Cambridge, it was in London, but it's not here, unfortunately.
That was because of space, purely.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, see, I love that because there's this great passage. It's so Hals, it's so old Hals, where on his tunic or his sleeve, there's these drips of painting. Not just, it's not deliberate, you know, the paint dripped. And what most artists would have to do is kind of
clean it up,
make it a little, and he just leaves it. And it's not like a little creative drip. It's like, it's dripping. It's like wrong. And yet, he's so confident by the end of his life, and he's so aware of what he's doing that he just leaves it. And it's this kind of bravura moment, and you think, if you're a young artist 200 years later and you see that, and you
that could be so inspirational.
What a freedom. Like, that is what, I don't have to follow all these rules. But, you know, it's true, just to relativize slightly. I mean, Rembrandt does do this as well, to a certain degree. I mean, there's a lot of freedom there, especially at the end. But it's something that I think, you know, there's so much confidence there of this dying man by that point. But I don't know, what was the rest of the question? There was another part of the question.
So given that you have this incredibly brave ending to his style, what does that suggest that we may or may not, what will people find in him now? That's sort of,
well, I hope
who is Hals
freedom.
now?
I hope they will understand that rules are made to be broken, but they don't always have to be broken. And you actually, I think you need to earn the right to break them as well. When you start off with just not cleaning up your canvas,
then you're
just
sloppy.
something about you.
Yeah, you're just probably hungover or something. But like when you're an 84-year-old genius, you can do it. And you see this with other people. I mean, I write about Beethoven, I write about Ibsen, Goya does this as well. There is a moment where certain artists break through the normal conventions. And I think it's always good to break through the normal conventions, but it has to be done in a certain way.
I mean, and besides freedom, I think inspiration, like you mentioned, I mean, we're hoping to get young people in the Rijksmuseum and maybe younger artists to encourage them to have their own style and, like you say, not really follow the rules if it doesn't apply to you. So younger artists, inspiration, freedom, I think.
And as somebody who's been working with these pictures over the course of 3 years, and you know them very well, do you expect a certain passage of his life to end up being more resonant with this young audience?
Well, that's tricky because we don't know a lot about his life. Maybe the pictures that would resonate most are the ones that appear to be confident, like the man posing with the Renaissance elbow with the arm on the hip, or maybe those pictures where we really see those brushstrokes. So these really late works, I think, could resonate more with like a younger audience than these really early ones where we still see like this Flemish trade, like late 16th century. So maybe the Regias or the Regentesses, especially if you know that the story about Whistler, I think that could really resonate with like a younger audience.
Okay. One thing we haven't touched on, which is maybe useful to talk about, is actually fabric. You mentioned he came from a textile trading family, and you see through the course of the exhibition his different handling of fabrics. Do you want to just talk about that technical?
Yeah, so what I
proposition for a
really
bit?
find interesting, if you look at those really early works by Hals, you have these costumes, textiles, lace or velvet, but he really switches every time between a very detailed approach when it comes to like buttons, but then this really loose brushwork when it comes to like collars or like these sashes in like orange or blue. But even in those like 1630 works, we see how switching up his style, switching up his brushes, but that ends completely during this late period where it all just becomes rough.
Yeah.
And that's why we call actually that room smearing, because we actually see that he's putting on the paint so thickly. But if you look at the fabrics, I think especially if we look at the official portrait, that's so interesting because we can have a sleeve with like 5 or 6 brushstrokes, but then the bodice being very detailed. I think that's really interesting that it's not always one style, but it's different colors, sometimes 27 shades of black in one dress, but then very minimal buttons, but very detailed, and then this very wide collar. So I think it's interesting that if you are going to have a look at the way that Hals is painting in these fabrics, in these costumes, because that's not just one set of painting, it always changes. I mean, if you look at Katharina Hooft, one of the highlights from the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, the dress of the child or of the toddler, that's so detailed, but if you look at the dress of the nurse, of the Min, that's been done to a completely different level. So I think sometimes in one painting, if you look at dress or costume, we see 2 different styles, but that's by the same artist. So I think that's really interesting.
Yes. It almost works out as a metaphor for Hals in every, the 2 styles on the same canvas. So a final question for both of you, I think, is you've spoken about bringing the young in and inspiring them, but who is Hals for you?
Well, for me, my life story in one sentence is that I moved to this country in 2002 because I met a Dutch person and I decided to move to Holland. I was 25, I thought, why not? And I was glad he was from Holland and not from some really much more crazy exotic country. However, it turned out that once I got here and beneath everybody speaks English, everybody, it seems like a pretty easy country to live in. You get to know, you realize that there's a culture there that's so much deeper and that's so invisible to you as a foreigner. And so I started digging into this culture and started writing about art. The moment that happened for me, that I thought, where am I, was in the Frans Hals Museum. And it was in front of the Regent and the Regentesses, which are the final gallery of the show in Amsterdam now. I had never seen anything like it. Now, I'm American, and so in the United States, we have quite a lot of Hals, as we do of a lot of pretty much all the other Dutch painters. But they're smaller. You don't have the idea of this ambition. You don't have the idea of this incredible scale. And also the closeness, and we keep seeing Malababa come here, but one of the things that you get from Hals, or I got from Hals, is the closeness of the normal, nice woman walking down the street in Haarlem and Malababa. Just how there's something, he's very close to the boundary of madness. You see it in this freedom of this brushstrokes. It's freedom, but you realize that if he had one, now you can medicate all these things to the milligram, but if he had one less, if he didn't take his meds for one day, he would end up like this. You feel that. You feel that this is somebody who's using art as a way of finding himself in the world, and I was finding myself in the world. So I feel very close to him in a way that is probably completely wrong, I'm sure I've just totally invented it and made it up, but there's not that much biographical stuff that we know about him. You can do all sorts of analysis and talk about how there's half a cow that he gets sued over. Okay, but that doesn't really tell you enough. You can really, I think maybe more than any other Dutch painter besides maybe Rembrandt, he gives you a sense of himself, and you become quite close to him. Did you feel that? Close to him?
I think through my research and the fact that I worked for several years on the project, but I think for me, Hals can be seen through like different lenses in each century. So 17th century, relatively well-known painter, and actually until the 1640s, relatively wealthy. 18th century, drunkard. End of the 19th century, 20th century, the anti-hero almost. And I think if I look through my lens now, because I'm trained in my ways of looking at art, and I said this previously, I see this painter doing so much more than just official portraits. I think even those genre paintings, because the people that he's painting are up until the shoulder or the waist, can even be portraits. Maybe even if they don't have a name, I see Hals as this portrait painter of so many people. Cunera van Baarsdorp or Michiel de Waal, really wealthy textile merchant, but also Malababbe, also Fisher Boy. I think for me, I see Hals through a much more diverse lens than we did in 1989. So that's my approach to Hals, yeah.
Perfect. I think that's probably a very good moment for us to end this conversation. Ben and Tamar, can I thank you both very much for your exploration of Hals at TAFEF. Thank you.
You're welcome.